Okay, so now we're going to spend a couple videos talking about consciousness and different issues surrounding consciousness. So, this is kind of an abstract, sort of philosophical, heady topic in a lot of ways. So, I wanted to start with a quote to clarify some things from a respected neuroscientist, Julian Jaynes. So, when asked the question, what is consciousness? We become conscious of consciousness. And most of us take this consciousness of consciousness to be what consciousness is. That is not true. Consciousness is a much smaller part of our mental life than we are conscious of, because we cannot be conscious of what we are not conscious of. Clear everything up? If you feel like this when you hear that quote, I think you're not alone. That is a very confusing set of ideas. I'm not going to say that those are necessarily true or false things that he's suggesting, but even experts that talk about consciousness and the brain are not always super clear with how they use their terms or how they think about it or conceptualize it. And I'm not going to promise you in this unit that I'm going to give you a clear, satisfying answer of what consciousness is. But I can tell you that we'll talk about some things that have a lot to do with consciousness, things like attention and awareness and sleep and dreams, hypnosis, meditation, things like that. Will kind of get around some of the ideas that involve consciousness, although we might not really come to know exactly what it is necessarily. So, some definitions we might want to use about consciousness, maybe it's the subjective experience of perceiving oneself and one's surroundings, or the subjective awareness of internal and external events. Both of these definitions kind of, give some separation from who we are and what's going on around us. And very key implicitly in both of these definitions is recognizing that distinction between yourself and your environments and knowing how both of them are functioning to some degree. But this awareness of what's going on in our environment and within our own processing has limits, right? We can't pay attention to everything all the time, whether it's stuff in our environment or stuff going on within our own heads. We have attentional limits. We have limits of our focus. So to get around this and shift around our attention, we shift this awareness to make use of this limited amount of attention. We've kind of talked about this already in the cognition unit, right? That we can't pay attention to everything all the time. So we have to shift from more unconscious to more conscious reasoning and attentional abilities when we have the motivation and ability to do so. So, how do we shift our awareness then? How do we shift attention when we, need to prioritize what we're paying attention to? Some early studies that look at what people are aware of and attending to, and things that go on today, but this has a long history, something called dichotic listening studies. Dichotic meaning like two parts, where researchers have people listen to two different messages, one in each ear. So they're playing in the right ear, they're playing message A, and in the left ear, they're playing message B to people. And there are a lot of different ways they might use these studies to test things about awareness and consciousness. But participants oftentimes are asked to shadow or repeat aloud one of the message, making them ignore the other one. And what this leads to is if you quiz people on the message they shadowed, they usually have relatively good recall or memory of that, and relatively poor memory of the one they were not attending to, even though they heard it. They just were not paying attention or attending to it or really processing it very deeply. But we also know that the awareness of this is not, or the awareness of that unattended message is not zero. It's not that you're totally ignoring it. You're just kind of filtering it out. There's something called the cocktail party effect that shows that we are processing in some degree what's going on in these messages. This cocktail party effect comes from the idea that if you're in a crowded room, lots of people talking, lots of conversations that you're not part of, you might still pick up on key phrases, maybe most importantly, your name across the room or in a different conversation that draws your attention. So even though you're not processing all those other conversations, you might have some very minimal level of awareness of what's going on in them, enough to recognize important words to you, even if you've been actively ignoring it. So this seems to happen too if people are cued from something or by something important in the ignored channel. They will still be able to shift their awareness over to that one that's more important. A really interesting set of these studies by Treisman in the late 50s and early 60s had people repeat one of these messages, but they sort of tricked the participants. They switched which message was going to which side in the middle of the trials. So you'd start with, let's say, message A in the right ear and message B in the left ear, and halfway through they would switch. So message A would be in the left ear and message B would be in the right ear. So if people were getting these types of messages, like in the left, against the advice of the broker, the naive investor panicked, and in the right, released from his cage, the little lamb bounded into the field. These are out of context, they don't make tons of sense, but right, these things at least have some sort of internal consistency, being about a lamb or being about a broker. In the middle of these studies, if they switch these channels, people are going to hear, like, against the advice of the broker, the little lamb bounded into the field, which doesn't make any sense. Or released from his cage, the naive investor panicked. And what you would find in these studies is that most people would repeat, when they're shadowing, they would shadow the complete logical sentence, even though it has shifted sides. And people sometimes would not even realize that the feeds had switched. They would just track logically what was going on from the left ear to the right ear and continue on. So just another interesting, kind of set of results that show you that people are attending to both these channels to some degree, and they can even switch their awareness in a purposeful way based on the content they're hearing, even if it starts coming from a slightly different source. These are some examples of something we've, again, already talked about a bit, automaticity. We've talked about this as like system one, fast processing, and this is important here too. It requires very little attention most of the time. We've talked about other forms of this again in the memory unit, where we talked about procedural or implicit memories like riding a bike, some cooking activities. Maybe you drive home and you don't remember the whole drive, right? You just kind of are on autopilot in a sense. We can look at how automatized a different set of procedures are by doing different types of divided attention tasks. Basically, if a task is automatized, automatic tasks, they should not interfere with the second task. So, walking and having a conversation. The conversation is requiring some level of cognitive deliberation and attention. Walking is automatized because you're able to do it without interfering with that more involving second task. So the more automatic a task is, the less awareness that you need to have of it and less focus that you need to use. And this is a very adaptive thing for us to be able to do, so we can use our limited resources, our limited cognitive store of energy to focus on the more demanding tasks. So if you can walk without thinking about it, if you can, learn to play an instrument, then you can maybe sing at the same time, things like this. We can divide our limited amount of attention between different types of tasks. I want to mention a couple things as well about from our earlier units about how different parts of the brain process different parts of our visual fields and information. If you remember, excuse me, from some aspects of the biopsych unit, our brain processing is kind of flipped in some ways from what we would expect. That the right side of our body is controlled by the left side of our brain, the left side of our body is controlled by the right side of our brain, and the information from our right visual field ends up going to the left side of our brain, and the information from our left visual field ends up going to the right side of our brain, kind of like in these diagrams, where there's sort of a crossing of these streams, and information is processed sort of in the opposite place you might expect. So in a patient that has a split brain, like if you've had your corpus callosum severed, perhaps to stop you from having epileptic seizures or something like that, your brain can't communicate in quite that same way. All the information that comes from your right side is going to stay on your left side, rather than being able to, communicate properly across that bridge or that connection between the two hemispheres of your brain. Because normal functioning brains, again, they are sharing lots of information across the brain, even though there are processing centers that are focusing on certain activities. But because we know that different sides of the brain focus slightly more or less on more verbal or more spatial tasks, it's useful for your whole brain to be able to see your whole field of vision in a sense, right? But for people that have a surgery or an injury that causes a split brain, their more verbally processing left hemisphere is totally unaware of the things happening in the left side of their visual field or with the left side of their body. So I don't want to play the whole video here or any of it actually, but I would strongly suggest you watch this really interesting video about a split brain study about a patient who is, trying to draw and write things that he sees in different sides of his visual field. And the really interesting thing is when he sees words in the right side of his visual field, the left side of his brain that's more verbal can process that. When he sees drawings on the left side and his right brain processes that, there's a connection. But when it's flipped, he has some really interesting effects of what he's able to process and what he is aware of. So I again strongly suggest you take a look at that. Another kind of interesting related idea is a disorder that sometimes happens with brain injury patients called visual neglect. So this might lead you to just not notice something in one half of your visual field. So if you have damage to certain parts of your parietal lobe, you just ignore things on one side of your body. Maybe you're only shave one side of your face or clean one side of your body, or you're not noticing things in your visual field. My wife used to work with brain injury patients, and she had many patients that were like this. And she reported very frequently that, you give people a full plate of food, and people with this disorder, visual neglect, they might eat half of the plate, the part that they were processing visually, and think that they were done. And you would not be able to, you would tell them, well, your plate's still half full, and they would not be able to really process that. And you could turn the plate around and it would appear full to them again, and they would eat off the side that they're able to see. Very interesting. And you might also be able to give people pictures like these, for example. And if they have damage to their right parietal lobe and they're not able to process things properly in their left visual field, you could show them both of these pictures, and you could ask them, hey, look at these, focus on these. Which one of these houses would you rather live in? And one of them is very clearly, to a healthy brain patient, on fire. People with visual neglect that can't see things in their left visual field, they would look at these pictures and they would be able to tell you, well, I want to live in house A, the first one you showed me there. And they would not be able to explain why necessarily. They would be on some level realizing that they shouldn't live in this house, the one that has things on fire, but they wouldn't consciously know why. So the levels of processing are very complicated, and a lot of it is going on automatically, maybe more than we generally expect. So even without being consciously aware of things, we can notice things, and evidence from brain injury patients are telling us that we are aware of things and maybe even able to make relatively complex types of choices without really being aware of why we're making those types of choices. And if you think back to our cognition unit, this is somewhat related to another idea where, priming studies where we might not be aware of things that are driving our behavior all the time either. There, again, is controversial evidence, but still some evidence that, concepts that are activated in your brain are going to drive your behavior outside of your awareness. So we've already talked about this stuff to some degree. And in a lot of ways, some of these ideas go all the way back to Sigmund Freud. And I talked about Freud earlier in the class. We'll talk about him again when we get to disorders and treatment. And it's important to remember that a lot of Freud's ideas, like maybe most of Freud's ideas, are without any scientific basis whatsoever. But one really influential broad idea that he kind of normalized in psychology was that there is a lot going on underneath the surface for us. That you might think about the processing going on in our brains as like an iceberg. The conscious parts are above the surface and visible to us and things that we can access. but more is going on underneath the surface that we might not really be aware of, but still matters a whole heck of a lot. And we kind of discount this stuff a lot, even though it maybe is driving more aspects of our behavior and thinking and processing than even the conscious parts are. So, why do we possess consciousness at all? Right? I mean, think about, other animals, other creatures. We might, not really think about them as being conscious, sentient beings like us. Why do we have this ability to reflect on our own existence and processing, think about how we're separate from other things? Like, what is even the purpose of this? And different biological psychologists, evolutionary psychologists have explanations for this that, we can't really test directly, but they're interesting to think about. One reason we have consciousness might be because our intellectual capacities give us the ability to think about future events and kind of do mental simulations to try to think about if a certain behavior is wise or not. So it might be kind of proactive planning that we want consciousness so we can manipulate possible events to figure out what the right thing to do is. Another, maybe slightly darker sort of explanation about consciousness is that it's a spandrel. A spandrel is an evolutionary biology term that comes from architecture. A spandrel is kind of the unused space of a shape. Like in this instance, you have a rounded arch underneath a kind of rectangular sort of shape. The triangular space there in the corners used to go unused until architects realized that they could use it to design things and make things more attractive. So that spandrel is like an unintended sort of spot that doesn't serve a purpose, but we end up using it for a purpose. So in evolutionary biology, spandrels are these things that are not intended. They're not there to serve a purpose, but they exist nonetheless. So some suggest that our very consciousness is a spandrel, that it doesn't actually serve a direct purpose. It's just our experience of what our moment-to-moment life is like. Maybe we're not as in control as we think, and just our brain activity that is doing all this automatic sort of thinking is actually what's driving us, and we have sort of this illusion of control. Now, this is maybe a topic, again, for more of a philosophy class than a scientific psychology class, but it's kind of hard to rule this explanation out, that it's just kind of a byproduct or something that's sort of unintended and not even really necessarily that adaptive. So I'll leave you with that kind of weird thought, and we'll move on to talk about sleep, dreaming, hypnosis, and things like that in the next video.